Welcome to Alyosha Society, where we are pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness through great literature. New book, new topic, new shirt. Now, you guys can tell me a little bit later whether or not you think the social contract and the green go together. But we are indeed starting a new book today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. Just so you know, I'm using the Penguin version here. Take a look at that. I've hopefully already communicated the ISBNs to you. Would be a good idea to have the same version that I'm using, especially if you're taking the live version. But when I'm quoting from the book, I will give you the chapters and so forth. So if you have a different version, hopefully you can still find it. So let's get right to it. Not a lot of time to waste here. I'm going to be doing 5 total videos on the social contract, an intro video, and then 1 video on each of the 4 sections of the social contract. So let's get right to it. No time to waste. No time to waste. Oh boy. Social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. First of all, let's get some pronunciations down here. He's writing in French. So I know that looks like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but no. It's Jean-Jacques. Remember, the French, it's all nasal, and they don't really pronounce much. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We'll just call him Rousseau. How's that? So let's start basically where I almost always start. Do you remember the keys to understanding a book? Do you remember what approach we're using always? Yeah, historical biographical approach. Well, we've gone through several genres here, haven't we? We've looked at, let's see what we got in our pile of books here. We've done some satire. We have done some allegory. We even studied some poetry. But we're coming to a very different kind of genre now, a very different kind of genre. So how do you approach that? Well, it's going to be the same keys, my friend, the same keys to understanding political philosophy is our new genre with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And do you remember what those are? Historical biographical approach. You're probably hearing them in your sleep by now. What can I learn about the author? Why did he write this book? To whom was he writing? How would they have understood in their time, the first readers, how would they have understood what he was saying? And let's learn all we can about the philosophical, political, theological, historical context in which it was written. And then, of course, again, I'm going to be giving you specific questions and things to look for when you read any work of political philosophy, just like I gave you general ways to understand allegories and general ways to understand satire wherever you happen to see it, and poetry. So let's dive right in here. Let's start with the author. Who is this guy? I'm wondering if you've heard of him. I think that there is a good chance. There's a good chance that some of you, maybe you've never heard of this guy. Maybe you've never heard of him. Well, you're going to be learning quite a bit about him. So let's get started. First of all, we want to know when he was born, because what in the world was going on during this time? Guys, in this case, probably just as much or more than any other book we'll study this year, the when is extremely important. So he's born in 1712 in Geneva. And I want to talk about the popular topic of the day. Rousseau is living at a pivotal time in history. Think of a door on hinges. Okay, it's either going to swing this way or it's going to swing that way. It's a pivot. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is looking back towards the Middle Ages when governments and such and people existed throughout Europe in what we call a feudal system. A feudal system, radically different than what is slowly developing in the early 18th century. Feudal system was something like this, generally speaking. I'm really, really poor. let's say. All I really have to offer is my labor. So I'm going to go to a wealthy landowner and I'm going to say, look, it's a dangerous, crazy world out there. If I live on your land and I work your land and I do certain things for you, will you in exchange give me things like protection? Again, it was a scary, dangerous world. Protection. And can I eat some of the food I grow? Those kinds of things. That's a feudal system. We're not even really thinking in terms of, well, let's see, I live in Nebraska, in the United States, in North America, and in Nebraska, we have a governor. In the United States, we have the president, we have all these legislatures. No, 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 nothing like that in the feudal system. So when Rousseau is growing up, what's happening, students, is that the feudal system is in the process of going away. It's largely gone, but it's not totally gone. It's not totally gone until almost really the year 1800, really the French Revolution. So Rousseau, so what's on the minds of people during this time? And remember, guys, this doesn't happen overnight. Something like the feudal system takes hundreds of years to kind of go away and a new system come in. So what's on the minds of people when Rousseau is growing up? I got it right there on the screen. What in the world is the role of the people in their own government? Now you're probably thinking, Bruce, isn't that just like a common sense? Yeah, to us today, but not in the early 18th century, friends. You see, with the feudal system, you don't have your own government. You don't have the sovereignty of the people and right and you know, civil rights and all these things. None of that exists. So this is really the first time in Western history that man is thinking, oh, how do we actually form a government? What does that look like? Yeah. It's going to be very important. Well, let's talk about Rousseau a little bit. He was a very, very educated guy, and you're going to see that when you read The Social Contract. It's not a long work. It's fairly short work, really considered more of a, almost like a pamphlet, but you're going to see very erudite. He studied classical literature. He knew history extremely well. In terms of his faith, he grew up in a very Calvinistic region in Geneva, converted to Roman Catholicism, but then he ended up converting back. I wouldn't make too much of that in terms of his worldview, because these conversions really had more to do with practicality and politics than they had to do with actual belief. Here's one thing that a lot of people don't know about Rousseau. He was a musician. He was a composer, very talented, very gifted, and that's really what he wanted to do with his life. He even moved to Paris so that he could be in a position to be around people who knew a lot about music, so his music career would take off. That is not what he's known for today, but he was a very gifted, very talented musician. But here's what happened to him. Yeah, the politics bug bit him. In the 1750s, as he was growing up in this environment I've already described to you, where one of the biggest questions on people's minds was, how do you form a government of a country? That's another thing I didn't mention earlier. Nation states did not exist before this, guys. In the feudal system, there's no such thing as, well, let's see, we've got Spain over here. And when you're in Spain, you better obey the laws of Spain. And then we have France, and then we have Italy, and then we have Germany. No. It just wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. You know, each of these feudal lords kind of had their own little kingdom, and whatever the rules were for that little feudal system, There were no such thing as these nations. So as these nation states start to rise and nations start to form throughout Europe, these questions were on people's minds. And Rousseau was fascinated with the question of, oh, so what is a government going to look like in these nation states? So in 1762, he wrote the book that we're discussing here in these 5 videos, The Social Contract. Much, much, much more on that to come. Now, Rousseau also lived during the time of the Enlightenment. And if you've been listening to my videos, you've probably heard me use that term a time or two, the Enlightenment. What was it? Well, I've got a whole slide where I'm going to go over the ideas of the Enlightenment. Again, I've given you a little bit of the political world that Rousseau was growing up in. I want to give you a little bit more of the philosophical and theological world that he was growing up in, and that's going to help us understand the book as well. So much more on that to come. But take a look at his years here, guys. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau dies in 1778. So he's roughly, give or take, probably a little older, but in many ways, think about it, he is close to the same age as many of the founding fathers of the United States of America. Think about that. He dies just 2 years after the colonies proclaimed their independence, 1776. So he didn't really get to live long enough to see how this experiment was going to pan out. But he was growing up at the same time. He was influenced by many of the exact same authors that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Adams and the other founders of the United States were reading. They were reading a lot of the same authors. They were thinking about the same questions. I hope that helps. I hope that helps. So when you're reading political philosophy, what are specific questions that you should consider? Remember, I did this with allegory, and I did this with satire, and I did this with poetry. But this is a different genre. So I have a specific set of questions I want you to think about. First of all, what does the author, we'll just use the he here because this is a he, what does he point to as the final authority? Now, that's always going to be a good question to ask, friends. Does this person believe I'm the final authority? In other words, themselves. Do they believe that the Bible is the final authority? Do they believe that someone else or something else is authoritative? Is there some thinker that they sort of worship? Always good to know that going in. Is he reacting against something? Oh, yes. In this case, absolutely. We're going to be talking about the divine right of kings a little bit later. I've already talked a little bit about the feudal system, but this whole idea of the divine right of kings is something that was on the minds of individuals. Does God give authority to these people we call kings in such a way that they can do and say whatever they want and simply claim, hey, look, God put me here, so you can't question my authority? We'll get into that. What does he believe about the nature of man? You're thinking, Bruce, how in the world would a deep theological question like the nature of man? It has everything to do with government. If you believe that man is basically sinful, then you're going to say that he should be governed and he should govern in a certain way. But if you say that mankind is basically good, then you're going to conclude something very different about what government should look like. So the nature of man is tremendously important. What does he believe about the nature of God? Yes. Is authority ordained by God? Or do we just kind of make it up on our own? And what is God like? And what does that have to do with our government? What does he believe the primary purpose of government? That's a big one. Why does government exist in the first place? The founding fathers of the United States made that crystal clear. If you've read the Declaration, you've read the Constitution of the United States, you know the founders made that very clear. We're going to be talking about that as well. So this is a recap. This is a recap just to give you a reminder for context. Remember, we talked about how medieval man was essentially, by and large, had a Christian worldview, Christian perspective. And we're asking the question, what in the world happened along the way that changed all of that? And again, this ought to be review. This should be review. I said it was like going through a tunnel, and medieval man is trucking along in his medieval worldview car. You know, he's got on his K-Love on the radio, and he got his fish sticker on the back, just Christian worldview trucking along. But he goes through a tunnel. And when medieval man goes through that tunnel, do you remember the 3 speed bumps that he hits that ends up changing this medieval worldview? Hopefully you do. The Renaissance, a rebirth and an interest, a renewed interest in Greco-Roman art and philosophy and culture. Huge. When you say, hey, let's go back and start thinking like the pagan Greco-Roman world, that's going to change things, isn't it? The Reformation. Many good things come out of the Reformation. One thing that might not have been so good was the idea of individualism. I can decide this. I can read the Bible on my own. I can be my own authority. And then for our purposes here, remember the other speed bump was the Enlightenment. Once again, hang tight. I've got a whole slide where I'm going to go over the doctrines of the Enlightenment. But after medieval worldview man hits these 3 speed bumps, remember he comes out on the other end and poof, voila, he's modern man. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment basically convert medieval man into this new individual who thinks very differently now. And when we look at the aspects of the Enlightenment, you'll see that. So we have Michelangelo's David to represent the Renaissance. Remember, a very humanistic worldview, large hands, look at what man can do. Martin Luther translates the Bible into German, and the Protestants who end up really pushing this idea of it's all about my personal individual relationship with God. And then there's a picture of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We're going to use him as our sort of Enlightenment poster child, at least for now. So what exactly was the Enlightenment? All right, take a look at these ideas. First of all, it's basically, give or take, 18th century, so 1700s. Remember, guys, these things don't happen overnight. These things happen over decades and sometimes even over centuries. It's when we're talking about big movements like this, it's the general way that the culture is moving, drifting, thinking. Those trends. And you know those things happen over long periods of time. What were they? First of all, reason as the final authority. Reason. Well, what was the final authority before this? Well, I think you know that. During the medieval time period, by and large, this right here, the Bible, the Word of God, was viewed as inerrant and infallible and inspired by God, and it's the final authority. The Enlightenment thinkers came along and said, you know what? I think we can figure out a lot of this on our own just by using our own reason. Guys, that's a big shift. That's a big shift. It was even called the age of reason. And Western man starts to look at his progress in science and philosophy and politics and medicine and all these different areas. And he starts to pat himself on the back a little bit, and he gets fairly prideful about his own autonomy. And that word autonomy is just a fancy pants word that means my ability to function on my own. We got to get away from these silly superstitions and depending upon God and spiritual things and religion. We have to break free of that. And we can progress beyond that. Government as a social contract. Again, we're going to be looking at things in Rousseau that you're going to think, man, this just seems like common sense. But guys, it wasn't common sense in 1762. And then, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the word deism. Deism. Deism is the idea that there is a God. So it's not atheism or there's no God. Deism, however, is not a biblical view of God at all. Deism says there is a God and he did actually create the universe, he created the world, but he's not involved in it anymore. He made it and then he just kind of poof, threw it out there, wound it up, you know, kind of like the clockmaker. He winds up the clock and then he just lets it go. He is not actively involved in the world he created. This deistic worldview was very popular during the time of the Enlightenment. Some of the founding fathers of the United States were deists. Not all of them, but some of them. So there you have it. Now, this is an important slide. I want you to know the ideas of the Enlightenment. I want you to know the time period of the Enlightenment. I want you to be able to discuss the Enlightenment intelligently. All right. Now, to wrap up this video, just to let you know where we're headed, this is the introduction. We have gone over our keys to understanding. We'll be doing that a lot more. We've looked at the time period, the author, the audience, the philosophical and political world in which Rousseau lived. We looked at questions you asked to deal with this particular genre. That's our introduction. Now, in the next video, we'll be doing book 1. Then in video 3, book 2, and so forth. You can see it right there on the slide. In other words, I'm going to be covering one major section in each of the next 4 videos. New book, new genre, new shirt. Hope you like the green. See you in the next video, friends.